Hi, folks. Let me pull us back together, and we'll go ahead and get started. Kathy. So go ahead and grab a refill on water, coffee, and maybe we can get everybody back to their seats. It's my great pleasure to introduce these next two gentlemen, who I've known both of them in very different capacities for a long time. And I have to say I was looking forward to this particular panel as a juxtaposition of researchers and data topics at the extreme ends of scale of the extremely or infinitely large scale of astronomy and the very, very small scales of biological science and cytometry and bacteriological research. Bob Hanisch is a senior scientist for the Space Telescope Science Institute, as well as the director of the U.S. Virtual Astronomical Observatory. He is currently focusing on fostering multi-facility, multi-wavelength astronomical research through the virtual observatory. He's also worked in the areas of image restoration, electronic publications, and software systems design and management. And I realized, I've had Bob at a couple of different conferences speak, and I always learn something from what he has to say. And I realized, and I told him I didn't know if this was a compliment or a curse, to bear, that he is a honorary librarian and an honorable librarian. He really knows about, the tasks of managing information and providing access to information for his clientele. Mike Hulsey is a technical application specialist to the Immunocytometry Systems Group of Becton Dickinson Biosciences. And if you don't know Becton Dickinson, it is the largest vendor of cytometry equipment in the world, and actually probably biomedical equipment in the larger sense. He's worked at BD Biosciences since 2007 and is responsible for providing technical assistance to Becton Dickinson customers with all the instrumentation produced by BD. And how I came to realize that Mike was in this space of data management, it was very different from the way I've encountered our other colleagues today. It was actually on a very long multi-hour drive as we were driving our sons were in the same Cub Scout troop, and we were driving them to a camp out, and I was asking Mike, well, what do you do? And not knowing anything about what he did, and he told me all this stuff about all the issues he struggles with big data management issues, and I was like, okay, Mike, we've got to have you at this event. So I'm very pleased to have both these guys here, and I think we'll get a lot out of both their discussions. So please join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. You're really too kind, but I really appreciate being here, and Shannon for doing such a great job on logistics and everything. I also want to thank Myron and Steve for giving me such a great setup with your presentations this morning. I can breeze through my stuff because they've said so many things for me already, but no, that would be too easy. So I'm going to talk about astronomical data, virtual and real, shared and open. And I'll touch on, I hope, each of these topics as I go through the presentation here. I'll skip my abstract. Data in astronomy is varied to the utmost in terms of its form and content. For those of you who are not astronomers, some of these images may look like total gibberish. The one at the upper left in particular is visibility data. Radio telescopes don't actually make images directly. They observe in the Fourier transform domain, and that data then has to be transformed mathematically into a form that looks like a conventional image. We collect data that is spectroscopic, so basically intensity is a function of wavelength. We collect data which is a time series, intensity as a function of time. Sometimes time is evenly sampled, more frequently it's not evenly sampled. We do make images. Here are X-ray, radio, and optical images of the same object, a jet of emission from a large galaxy. And it's the comparison of data from these different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum where the real science comes, where the real physics can be understood. And so it's really essential to be able to bring together these diverse data sets from different telescopes operating both on the ground and in space into a framework where the data can be easily compared. And doing this, of course, requires very high quality of metadata management, and that's why the question I asked in the previous session, getting the metadata right, is critical to solving this problem. So in astronomy, we have something around 70 major data centers and observatories with substantial online data holdings, about 10,000 different data resources, being catalogs, surveys, archives. These data centers host anywhere from hundreds of terabytes to as much as petabytes. This number of a petabyte total I actually did a couple of years ago. I suspect it's now several times larger than that. The current growth rate is around 0.5 petabyte per year and increasing. But the really interesting datum here is this data request rate. So data is coming out of the archives for use by astronomers who did not take part in proposing those observations at a higher rate than data is going in. This means that data is being repurposed beyond the original intent for which that data was taken. For the Hubble Space Telescope, which is where I work at the Space Telescope Science Institute, the data retrievals are 3 times the data ingest rate. And that means also that the scientific publications based on Hubble data now come predominantly from people who are using the data in a repurposed sense. This is great. This is fantastic news. This means that we are getting maximum scientific return for the taxpayer investment in an instrument as complicated and expensive as the Hubble Space Telescope. But that is happening because the data are well calibrated, well documented, and the metadata tagging is complete and thorough and correct. So the data in our field are distributed and heterogeneous, but there are some commonalities. We also typically have a 12 to 18 month proprietary period on data, which allows the original investigator to do the scientific research project that they competed to get time for with the telescope, but then it becomes generally wide open for public access. Some private observatories still have kind of a lockdown on their data, but I think peer pressure and community pressure is gradually changing that, so we will see more and more open data in astronomy where we have already a very strong tradition of open data. And I just wanted to insert this comment about virtual data. By this I mean often when you make a data request, there's some pre-existing data file that is returned that satisfies your request. A virtual data request requires some sort of on-demand, on-the-fly computation. It might be subsetting of an image. It might be building a mosaic of multiple images that cover a larger region of the sky. It might be a reprojection to a different coordinate system. It might be the result of a database query. The database exists, but your particular view of that database only exists after you make a particular query. And so that's all virtual data. Virtual data can also live in a virtual storage space, basically a cloud-based storage. In the virtual observatory, we have our own standard, international standard called VO Space. And the strength of this is that you can integrate access to this virtual storage space with the science applications, tools, and utilities so that I can actually run a science application, write my result directly into a VO space, and I can share that VO space with my collaborators so that we have transparent and easy access to the data that we're working on together. And then ultimately, as a collaboration or a team is working on data, they can say, okay, I'd like to make this data in my VO space publicly accessible. We would harvest the metadata, publish that data according to a standard VO data access service. The battery is going down. I'm running out of power. Plug me in quickly. Okay, somebody's going to fix this, I hope. So just, it still is unhappy. Can I close this? All right. So just to belabor this point a little bit, archival data is extremely important in astronomy. It's a major contributor to scientific productivity. 10 years ago, doing archival-based research was sort of considered a second-class science. If you weren't proposing for new observations, going to a telescope, sitting in a cold control room on a mountaintop, you weren't doing real science. That has all changed now with the quality of archives and the validation that's been given to the process of using archival research for new purposes. And these graphs show that, again, 2/3 of the research papers being written on Hubble data are by people not associated with the original observation taking, and those papers are cited, have just the same scientific impact as papers based on original non-archival observations. So this is really first-class science. Myron already talked about LSST, so here's my version of it. The update is that his data volumes were factors of 2 to 10 under what is now expected. So it's this huge camera on this huge telescope. There are expected to be now somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million transient event detections every night. This is one of the key goals of the LSST, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, is to look for things that change as a function of time, to look for moving things that we don't know about, to look at new classes of variability that are currently unknown. And all data from LSST will be public from the get-go. Another example is ALMA, the Atacama Large Millimeter Array. This is a radio telescope being built in Chile at a 5,000 meter altitude. You don't want to go there unless you really have to because you can't breathe. 66 antennas. It hasn't rained in this desert where this is being built for about 95 years, I think, so it's a very high and dry climate. Also, something you'll learn about astronomers in naming their telescopes, if there's an L in the acronym, it means large. If there's a V in the acronym, it means very. If there's an E in the acronym, it means extremely. We're not the most imaginative when it comes to naming things. But here's an example of the data growth. ALMA will be producing 5 petabytes of data within the next 2 years. The LSST, 70 petabytes by 2020. The databases are really quite incredible, 100 billion row databases. And so we have to do science with these databases in a way that is really different than what we're used to now. You might submit a query and the result will come back and be a billion row subset. That's still a lot of rows. Those rows are highly multidimensional with 1,000 attributes per row. So we're talking about immense amounts of data that you cannot possibly download to your did I hit the wrong thing? Okay, if you don't want me to talk, it's all right. We're going to reboot. Battery is low. It's plugged in, but is the plug plugged in? Is this counting against my time? I could just speak to them.
Go ahead. I need the password for the computer. I'm locked up. Yes, sir. It says it's locked. It says it's locked. Well, it did shut all the way off.
I can just go on and talk, and then we can catch up with the visuals later. As usual, the visuals are more to help me remember what I was going to talk about than to illustrate anything profound. But one other example of large data, again, I think was mentioned in Myron's presentation, which is the Square Kilometre Array, which is a next-generation radio telescope contemplated to be built in Australia and or South Africa. The Square Kilometre comes from the additive collecting area of the dishes is equal to 1 square kilometer in area. And there are literally hundreds of dishes and different kinds of receiving antennas constituting this telescope. Its data rate is 10 gigabytes per second of raw data. It collects an exabyte of raw data per day. And reduced data is about a petabyte. So this is, talk about drinking from the fire hose. This is just beyond the pale, and fortunately I'll probably be retired before this comes into operation, so it won't be my problem to worry about. I'll be right taking it away. So a few other observations. These are actually care of my colleague Alex Soleil at Johns Hopkins. The data rate is doubling every year. This is not just in astronomy, but many other fields. And that means that data is everywhere. There's this idea that we once had of big centralized repositories that covered all sorts of areas within a discipline is long past in terms of history. We need to have scalable architectures for dealing with this large amount of data volume. We need a whole spectrum of computational resources to deal with it, from desktops to Beowulf clusters to large big iron data centers. And Alex points out universities are hitting the power wall. This also came up before. This was very graphically demonstrated at Johns Hopkins last year when the transformer that powers the physics and astronomy building overheated and set on fire because they had exceeded their power capacity in the building. And so they ran on temporary power trailers with diesel generators for about 3 months while they rebuilt their power system. So we have huge challenges ahead of us. To do data management right requires well-characterized archival data. Oh, here we go. Progress. Thank you. All right. Can I get rid of this now? Okay. All right. Let's see. Data management. And the project I'm currently leading, the Virtual Astronomical Observatory, is, I think, a key part of how we manage and access this data in the coming years. Data discovery and federation, which Steve addressed so clearly, is enabled by the Virtual Observatory. But there are huge challenges. These database technologies that can handle up to 1 billion to as much as 1 trillion rows. The network bandwidth, the metadata management that I mentioned before, support for long-term access to survey data. Where does data live once the project that created it no longer is in existence. And I think Saeed is maybe going to talk about that a bit later. And so clearly we have to plan and budget for comprehensive archiving, long-term curation, and compatible access through the virtual observatory standards. I'm going to skip ahead since I think a lot of the NSF interests were already addressed earlier today and go tell you more about the virtual observatory. So the VO is primarily a tool for data discovery, access, and integration. It's an international collaboration focused on metadata standards, data models, and data access protocols. It encompasses all types of astronomical data, including images, spectra, time series, catalogs, and databases, also these event notices of things that change in the night. We share development efforts on software and services. We have a mechanism for managing distributed computational resources and for allowing applications to talk to each other so that you don't have to build all sorts of bells and whistles into one sort of mega application. There are 19 national and international organizations that collaborate, and we work together patterned on the WWC consortium idea, where we have a series of promotions of standards up to a full recommendation. The architecture is also something that was reflected earlier today. Users are at the top of this diagram. Data providers, resources are at the bottom, and there are these sort of three main pathways for finding data going down the left side, retrieving that data coming up the right side, and the core services in the middle that support this. And I will not go through this in very much detail except to show you that the standards that we develop all support this general architecture, and there are a lot of them, but in a very specific way. And so this is stuff that you as end users don't need to know about the virtual observatory, but there is a very carefully thought through infrastructure that makes this data discovery and data access and management of computational services work across all these diverse distributed data collections. Something that's also interesting to me as a developer of this technology is that in other areas where similar infrastructure has been developed, essentially the same solutions have been found. In oceanography, in space sciences, in you name it. Any place that there is a virtual observatory, it is basically doing about the same things in terms of the architecture. A little bit more user-oriented view is that you are here at the top of this picture. You have tables of sources that you're interested in. You have photometric measurements. You've got imaging data. You've got the science you want to do. You want to be able to share your data with the virtual observatory infrastructure. Cross-matching is comparing catalogs, finding data that is related to yours that you don't already know about, visualizing those data as images, as spectra, as time series, and then analyzing those data sets. This requires accessing and retrieving data from the telescope and mission archives, sharing your data with the community, and sharing your data through the published literature. And so this is really intended all to work as a seamless whole, and that's really what we're trying to do. These VO tools and applications at the middle layer talk to each other, so that if you are looking at an image display and you want to highlight an object of interest, that object will be highlighted in a table showing all of the objects that are known in that field of view. So it's really trying to build a seamless infrastructure for research in astronomy that builds on the vast wealth of data holdings that we have. Integrating this into the scholarly publication milieu is also extremely important. The journals, the preprints, and the images or data that are presented there are a fundamental part of the data and the scientific process itself. And so we want data-friendly publication policies, long-term stewardship solutions, and we have been collaborating with Saeed's project, the Data Conservancy, through the DataNet program, and of course we're aiming to support the data management plan policies that the NSF announced a year ago. So this is sort of a cartoon of how our data sharing and publication is going to be working. So at the bottom here, called the VAO portal, you have a user that's interacting with various scientific tools and utilities. they can share data into a VO space, and the VO spaces can replicate data with one another so that you don't have single point of failure, you have replication. We're also working with a group at Harvard building a facility called the Dataverse, which is another repository function. We want to make the VO space compatible with Dataverse so that if you publish data through a Dataverse, we can discover it in VO space and vice versa. And if you put data into a VO space, this VAO plugin shown here is a tool that does automated metadata extraction and validation. So that if I share a collection of images that I've just processed, in astronomy we have a data standard called FITS, the Flexible Image Transport System, which has been in use now for some 30 years. And many common metadata fields can be extracted from a FITS header and then used for data discovery purposes. We can also present metadata that's been extracted and to the user and say, this is what we found. Is this look right to you? Or have we missed something important? This is the VAO website, usvao.org. I'm just going to flash quickly through a couple of things here showing you the kinds of capabilities we're bringing to the research community in our science toolkit. We do data discovery, which is basically one box, type in a coordinate or an object name, and we can, within a few minutes, tell you where in those 10,000 resources that we know about there is data that might be of interest to you for that position or that object in the sky. This is just an example of finding Sloan Digital Sky Survey data through the VAO of a very famous galaxy called Messier 87, which is, in fact, that galaxy I showed you at the beginning with the jet of emission. Just to say, though, I could find this data going directly to the Sloan database, but with this tool, I can find data at 10,000 different resources with one query. Think of this as kayak.com for astronomy, okay? Find the best airfare, find the best data that matches my interest. And then ultimately, just like when I buy an airline ticket, I don't actually buy it through Kayak. I buy it through United or I buy it through American because I want my customer relationship with the person who's providing the service. We do exactly the same thing. We pass you through to the data provider so that you can explore the data in depth in that data collection. This is a tool for building and analyzing spectral energy distributions. SEDs are the key to astrophysical understanding of what is going on in an object. You use this to fit different models to the type of emission, and this tells you if you're dealing with a thermal source of emission, a non-thermal source, synchrotron radiation, various kinds of mechanisms that are responsible for producing the radiation that we see. So here's an example of a fit. Cross-matching is an extremely important tool. If you have, say, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey with its 100 billion objects and the TUMAS infrared survey with its 100 billion objects, you want to quickly determine what is the correlation between those two databases. And our cross-matching services provide that capability. So what's next? The long tail of the data distribution is this easy sharing and data publication with VO space, with on-the-fly data, metadata extraction and publication to VO compliant services and protocols, and integration of that publication process with scholarly publications. Also, we call the long tail of the astronomer distribution. We want to make sure that all of our applications and tools can reach everybody, regardless of whether they are at a high-end, well-funded major research organization or if they are a lone astronomer in a small college in Denton, Texas, for example. So VO tools all interoperate, all on every desktop, a VO applications ecosystem. We also realize that we can't build all tools for all comers. And so we want to allow access to our VO protocols to programming environments that are widely used in the research community. And so Python is currently the most popular scripting environment. And so you'll be able to do all of these things that we do through our high-level interfaces from a programmatic perspective using Python. And then this all has to be scalable. 1 billion by 1 billion row cross-matching, fast transfers among archives and VO spaces, and server-side analysis and visualization, because you can't download it all. You never will be able to. So to conclude, astronomy data is primarily an open resource, and we're working on those organizations who are not yet providing open access. The majority of open access data in astronomy is now VO accessible. Data in the virtual observatory is both real, in that it exists and can be copied byte for byte, and virtual, in that it is constructed dynamically in response to a user request. And we are working to enrich the data sharing and publishing infrastructure. So thank you very much. Sorry for the text glitches.
Thank you. Thank you. So from that perspective, I guess it's on the technical person. If something goes wrong, I'm the one that's going to have to fix it, right? So I'm looking at this coming in here from a completely other end of the spectrum, literally, so to speak. So Robert's talked about astronomy and everything, and what I do for research and what I deal with is inner space, what goes on inside your body and your blood and diagnostics and things like that. And also I'm the user. I'm the person at the other end who's generating the data. Okay, now I've generated all this data. What do I do with it? So I came to this having no clue what this was all about, and I've found out a whole lot in just this morning, and things that I didn't realize before that can really help us a lot. And so, like Martin said, I'm technical applications for BD. I used to work in a core lab at Emory University and generate the data for that. BD is a worldwide company. You may not have ever heard of them, but you probably use their products as syringes and diabetes kits and all of things like that. So if you go to the doctor's office, then you're probably using some sort of BD product. And so what I deal with is called flow cytometry. And when people like Martin, they ask, what do you do for a living? You get, okay, do you want the long version? Do you want the short version? And you go into the long version, and about 20 minutes in, their eyes start to glaze over, and you realize that they don't know what you're talking about. So what I'm going to do, you guys get the very short version. So there's just a couple of slides here to talk about what it is and what it does. And so it's a technology that brings a lot of things together, like physics and biology and chemistry and all these different things. And so what you do is you have a cell. You tag that cell with a fluorescent probe of some sort. You take it, put it into a carrier like a sheath. You run it past a laser intercept. The laser lights up those fluorescents, and then that's detected. And so flow cytometry, if you break it down into the Latin, flow a stream, cyto your cell, and then to measure that. Okay? And so what do all these have in common is we can measure any of these with flow cytometry, i.e. they're all very small, protozoa, algae, chromosomes, mostly blood, but just about anything else you can think of. And how this data is generated, this is just a basic format of what it looks like. You have the instrument, and then you run that cell past the laser, and that automatically generates 6 different types of data. That goes into the computer, and then you get 3 or 4 parameters. This is just basic 1 laser, 3 parameter information right off the top. And so a lot of the uses for these, we're going to monitor your immune system. We're going to look at different things. We're going to do immunophenotyping. We're going to see if you're healthy. We're going to see if you're not healthy, whether your white blood cell count is up or something like that. It came into prominence back in the 80s when HIV came along. It was used for CD4 counts. It was a really easy way to tell. Take your blood, process it, be done, find out what your CD4 counts are in less than an hour or so. Now it's grown exponentially into many different things. It's used as a diagnostic tool for different types of cancers like AML, CML, and then it's also used for basic research in all sorts of areas ranging from blood and things like that, but we also do ocean water testing, algae testing, and different things like that, vaccine development and specific drug interactions and all of that type of thing. Right, so this is another graph. So that first picture I showed you, the basic data and generating 3 parameters and things like that, this is what you can get really quickly with just 1 laser and 8 parameters. And this is what goes on inside of your blood, and you have all these different markers, and you can see, okay, this percentage is good, that percentage is good, you don't have cancer, you're in great shape. Right? Now, that was a basic instrument from back from the 80s, and now we have instruments that have multiple lasers and many parameters. I was recently working with an instrument that has 7 lasers and 24 parameters, and so it's got more information than you can imagine sometimes that it's generating. So if you look at what I've written down here on the bottom, so you have more parameters, means more data, means larger files, means more storage space. So a typical file like this one here you can get, and you're talking about maybe 2.5 megabytes worth of data. You move up to 12, and now it's 33 megabytes. You move into 24, and it gets exponentially larger. And now every time you do an experiment, typically in a research lab, you're going to have 10 or 12 or more samples per that experiment. So now we're easily up to, with one experiment, we've got 3.3 gigabytes worth of data. All right? So what do I do with that? How do I store it? And things like that. So what I did at Emory is you have a flow cytometry core, and so what that means is you have a lab that has shared equipment, multiple high-end instruments. We're talking about our instruments can be $500,000 to $1 million a piece, depending on what you've got and what you order with it. These labs are centrally located on campus, and so you charge these labs back to the users. The users come, they use your services, and then they go about their business, they take their data, and they go like that. So that's good because most labs don't have $1 million to throw away on a piece of equipment, but if they share it, then everybody can use it, and they can all pitch in a little bit and get things done. Okay, well, you've got to store that data, all right? And so being a manager of a core, what do I do with this data? And so it's been my experience in the past, and it's, okay, we take this data and we set up a server for you somewhere, and you throw data on there, and there's no archiving, there's no management. It's just, okay, you're on your own. We set it up for you. You can do whatever you want to with it. And so I'm probably one of the people that Carly's looking at is exactly, we have no clue. We're biologists. We don't know what to do with this data. So get down to the data storage plan for that, and it's what plan? It's, I'm holding the data, and now what do I do with it? So who's responsible for that? Ultimately, in the end, Now, I did a search, and there's cores all over the country, and every campus all over, and I did a search, and I found one core that actually had a data management policy, and this is it. I didn't put this up here expecting you to read it, but as you can gather just glancing at it, it's pretty complicated. You got to do, log into the server and then transfer your data, and then you got to do this and then take your data and do that, and blah, 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 blah. And as we were talking about earlier, most scientists are pretty lazy, and they don't want to do all this. All right? So now it falls on the core manager to do that, because what do we do? So, there's no IT plan, there's no database training, we don't have any of this. What do I do with this data? But I have to keep it somehow, because if you lose it, it's ultimately going to be your responsibility. Somehow a PI or a student or somebody's going to come back to you eventually and say, where's my data? I deleted that file, I lost my memory stick, I don't have, where is it? Oddly enough, I got an email this morning from somebody who had done just that. One of my users deleted their data from the file. Can I retrieve it from the database and blah, blah, blah? You can, but it's not a very easy process. So you try to get your users to be responsible for their own data, and most of the users being undergrads or grad students or something like that. It's kind of like getting your children to clean up their room or something like that. They'll do it if you really, really push them. Right? And so that ultimately, like I said, falls back on you. Okay? So our software for these instruments are database oriented, so it makes a database, but you've got to keep that clean. It doesn't go on forever. These databases get bigger and bigger and bigger each time you use, and so like in my core we had 9 instruments and I had about 200 users, and so these databases get ridiculously big. So you have to clean them out or the software slows down and the instrument stops working, and then people complain because their instruments aren't. It takes me forever to collect my data. So you have to remove it. So how do you do that? Well, here again, from this same core, they had a policy for that as well. And once again, I don't expect you to read this, but you've got to export the data from the database, and then you have to transfer it to the server, and then you have to go back maybe transfer it from there into a repository, which they happen to have one set up, but I can tell you that most do not. And then you have to go back into the software and delete your experiment from the browser in order to get that out of the database, and it just gets gets ridiculous. So you have to remove it. So how do you do that? And so now it's on my job. Now it's my job. So now what do I do? So I need to archive it. I need to store it. I need to do something with it. You could send out notes to users and say, if you don't get your data and come and take it away, I'm going to delete it. But they never come. So now I have to put it on DVDs, and now I put it on a DVD and I throw it in a drawer, and I've got a drawer full of DVDs, or I've got a server somewhere, but there's no real go find the data. You have to search somehow or something like that, but it's not really indexed or anything like that. It just gets harder and harder. And so from my perspective, it's what's the plan? What can we do? And so, who owns that data? Who's responsible? It's not the core manager's responsibility. It's their responsibility ultimately, but is it the researcher's data, or is it the core manager's data, or does it belong to the institution, or does it belong to the person that gave them the grant money to do the research in the first place? So that's why I'm already gotten several pages of notes today. So what resources are available, and as we found out. So this program that she was talking about earlier, this is awesome, but I can tell you that it's not being advertised. I didn't know anything about it, and I know that all the core managers that I've talked to since Martin invited me to come here is they don't know anything about that, and they're all jumping all over it. Yeah, I'd love to hear about that. I want to see how to do that. I need to know what to do with this data or something like that, or how do I store this data? And so having this information and being able to spread it is great, and then it's kind of up to you guys to get this word out, to get it to the people so they'll understand, so we can get this data collected, because we are collecting a lot of this data, and it goes on and on and on, and so then we have open access and all of that type of thing, which is exactly what you guys are talking about today. So how would that benefit scientific research, in my mind, being the actual research person? And so you have bioinformatics, basically the Human Genome Project, so there's all that data that was collected, but easier access to the latest information, whatever it might be. And my particular interest is public health, and so quicker and easier access to the latest research, which will ultimately lead to better knowledge for better vaccines or something like that. I recently went to a conference about TB, and they're developing a new TB vaccine, and the WHO has put down a mandate to eradicate polio by the year to eradicate TB by 2015. Well, in order to do that, we have to have individualized vaccines, because everybody responds a little bit differently. TB is a little bit latent in you, a little bit differently than everybody else. So the knowledge of how each group reacts to that will be extremely helpful in developing those vaccines. Same thing with influenza, being able to get the latest information quickly and easily, and developing a new influenza vaccine or something like that. That changes every year. And so flu is like that. It's very adaptive. It'll change from year to year. So you got to have something different every year, and to be able to have that information in front of you, pull it out quickly, develop the vaccine, and get it out to the public will be extremely helpful. Right? And that's really all I have. Like I said, it's what I'm learning today is awesome, and I can spread that to you guys. Hopefully you have some questions. But so, yes. Okay. Oh, thank you. That's what I've done from the beginning.
Better? Okay. Thank you. I'm a student at UNT. I'm a PhD candidate in applied technology and performance improvement. But my love is health informatics, okay? Specifically electronic health records and also public health. How are we going to generate that? You said that area was public health, was increasing knowledge, but that's about infectious disease. Right. My love is chronic disease. What's going to happen with diabetes and heart disease and asthma, the top 5. chronic
It's the same
disease?
thing here. I just didn't write it down here, but it's the same thing.
Is it?
And yes, and so public health as well. And then there's also security, which I also forgot to
Yes.
mention, because we all know how security is. You can't get into clinical records. I mean, the HR department for the company I work with, I haven't even looked at my paycheck in a year because it's too hard for me to get into the account, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's, my wife does it. I assume I'm still getting paid. So, but all of that is a part of it as well. It's just, I just had a couple quick bullet points, but vaccines are being developed. We're aging, and we're outgrowing our vaccines. So now we have to come up with new vaccines for older people. So like the vaccines for shingles and things like that. So, all of these need to be created, and the latest information, we can do
Yeah,
that
it
more
needs to
quickly.
be accessed because
We need to be able to access
when
that.
I was just speaking to someone out in the hallway when we had the break. I said, when you look at the reports that come from CDC, CDC has to gather that information for like diabetes and obesity epidemic. When you do your research, you're looking back and you say, okay, the most recent information is maybe 2008. We're
Right.
only in 2012. Where's the new information? Well, it's because CDC has to gather information from about almost 200 different agencies. And if we could have something
Right.
like that, where
Yes.
you could just tap into it and do your query or whatever, and
Right.
it
CDC
might
is right
be a
down the
little
street.
faster.
CDC's right down the street from my house, and they have whole buildings of people that's all they do is gather that information and then try to plow through it. If there
Yes.
was some ways that we could get through that a lot easier, then, and this type of thing is what you really need to do that. Yes, and-
Doreen Nestle, University of Utah. I have a quick question. Which institution had that data management plan?
That was in Cincinnati, Cincinnati Children's Hospital.
Oh, really? Okay. All right,
Right.
thanks.
They just had the ambition to actually write one down. It's just everybody sort of has a plan, but they don't really publish it. So. Anyone else? Yes, Mark?
This is actually a question for Bob. So I think the VAO has done a great job of getting organized. How long did it take to sort of get everything straightened out and get those coordination channels and vectors in place between all the organizations that you work with?
Well, it's been going on for a decade now, and in fact, it's going on this week in Champaign-Urbana, which is where I'm going tonight. That chart that had all those little blue boxes of all the pieces of infrastructure, all those standards, have taken 10 years. The first couple, how do you find a catalog? How do you find an image? They were pretty easy. But once you get beyond the skim the cream and start to look at more complicated things, like how do you expose an entire database schema so that you can pose an arbitrary complicated query to that database. That particular project took about 5 years to agree on that, and we have it now. But implementing that interface is also then non-trivial. So we have to build software libraries that are reference implementations that show you how to expose your database according to the VO standards. I think it's fair to say that at this point, after a decade, we've hit the sweet spot. We have enough infrastructure developed that the focus can really change to doing science with this infrastructure rather than building more infrastructure. There will still be enhancements that need to happen. Information technology itself changes, and so the way you implement these things you'll want to change as time goes on. But I think we've pretty well filled in the infrastructure diagram with the standards that we need. And the time is now to really turn this around and turn it into an engine for scientific discovery. So that's where we're at.
So this is a follow-up question to both of you. Just if you would care to speculate, I know I've had conversations with Mike about this, about what sort of training programs, either we have a number of information scientists in the crowd that are interested in training professionals in data curation, digital curation topics. what sorts of training programs would be reasonable, manageable, not, something that people would have to get a whole other master's in, but would be useful preparation, for example, Mike, for a core manager, what you're terming a core manager or other functions, and in the astronomical field, I don't know how it works there, if it's, again, the junior researchers or the core managers that get charged with these duties, but what sort of, I've heard anecdotally from in other conversations with NSF folks that there's a lack of preparation among junior researchers, and I'd be curious in any speculative comments either of you had on that.
So, is this one? So I've talked to cores all over the country since we started doing this, and every one of them was interested, but core managers tend to be busy. They have their own projects, and then they have to deal with 200 users, and there's always something wrong with something, and so they don't really have a lot of time. But if there was some sort of online class, or maybe a really short 2-week class, not necessarily a degree per such in data management, but to help them understand how to use the tools, how to archive, and how to data management, and how to make it so that you can do metafiles, so you can use this type of stuff that they've come up with, and they were all interested. They all was like, yeah, I'll do that. That's awesome, and that would help dramatically. And then you would be able to get this information out to open source and go from there.
So in astronomy, most of the people involved in data management are astronomers or have been astronomers who have moved sort of out of a pure research career into more of a infrastructure support kind of career. But with the advent of these large-scale surveys, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey being sort of the first in a long series, we've identified the need for people who are really professional data scientists. They do require domain expertise in astronomy. In fact, we fielded a question on our VAO answer line from a student saying, why do astronomers build these databases anyway? What are they good for? And I said, well, my first answer was go and take an astronomy course. But you do need to understand, the magnitude system in which we measure the brightnesses of objects. You need to understand some of the characteristics of different types of objects in order to know what metadata is important for what domain of study. So there is a crossover, but we also need people who come from communities like yours who know how to organize information, who know how to structure things. Talking with Alan Rainier about ontologies, and how do you say what something is? We had this discussion at dinner last night about whether the creator is the name of a person or is what was it? It was too subtle for me, but it was very important to Alan.
I didn't understand it.
Strings versus things. Okay, so we need crosstalk, I think, and that's why I'm here, is to help facilitate some of that crosstalk and learn from you all how you do this the right way, so that we can do our metadata management better in our discipline.
Hi, my name is Christy Peters. I'm with the University of Houston. In terms of education, I know that Syracuse University has just established a certificate of advanced study in data science. It actually only requires 5 classes. It can be taken completely online. So I know typically librarians are probably very interested in that sort of thing, but it's something that could really be, scientists could be encouraged to do something like this too, especially if you're, I'm a librarian who sort of fell into data services, so I'm interested in doing that as, I don't need an entire master's degree. I've got a master's degree in library science. The same probably could be said for a lot of scientists, right, who, when they initially got their PhD, did not think they would be dealing a lot with data management issues, and it's something that sort of could be done on the side to help with those sort of things if you're in a lab or a research group where that's important. So in terms of education, I think that's at least a viable option if you wanted somebody trained in that sort of thing.
Anything like that. It's just a matter of getting the word out. Like I said, most people aren't aware now that I've come here, then if I go to a core and they say, what do I do? Then I'm going to tell them all about this. And so I have a meeting to talk about my colleagues because we're all over the country. So that's awesome. But like me, I'm a scientist, but I became a core manager just by default. I'm clueless about how to do any of this. I'm a biologist. I'm not a data manager. So anything like that would be great.
It's interesting you mentioned Syracuse because we actually had a student from Syracuse work with one of our VAO partner organizations this last summer, getting domain expertise in astronomy, but bringing to it this more formal education from information science, and that was, I think, a great partnership. So she learned about us, we learned about best practices, and it was good for everybody.
With this, I'm not affiliated with Syracuse, so this isn't like an advertisement for them. But I mean, I'm sort of interested for the same reason. You fall into these things and you need something, right? But when you work full time, you can't stop everything and go acquire special training. So
Right.
I do think it's a good option. I think it's probably going to be developed at more institutions. There may be other programs like this out there. It's the only one that I'm familiar with.
Time for lunch.
Any other questions?
Well, please join me in thanking this panel, really stimulating.